Humanity entered the galactic community quietly. There were no grand announcements, no declarations of destiny, no claims of superiority. The first human vessels that crossed beyond their local stellar neighborhood carried survey teams, linguists, medical staff, and diplomats. Their hulls were unarmed by the standards of interstellar powers, their drives unremarkable, their energy signatures modest. They arrived not as conquerors, but as participants. The galaxy noticed them anyway, not because of their weapons or their technology, but because of what followed behind them. Human hospitals appeared wherever conflict lingered. Not military installations, not forward operating bases, but neutral structures anchored at the edges of war zones and disaster systems. Vast orbital medical stations. Planetary triage cities assembled in weeks. Deep space recovery vessels that responded to distress calls regardless of origin. Human doctors treated species they had never encountered before, learned alien biologies in real time, and adapted surgical tools on the fly. Human nurses worked shifts that would have broken other species, driven not by command protocols but by something the galaxy found difficult to classify. They treated enemies. They treated civilians. They treated prisoners of war abandoned by their own fleets. To humanity, this behavior was unremarkable. It was simply an extension of rules that had governed their own wars long before they had reached the stars. Hospitals were protected. Medical personnel were neutral. Wounded enemies were still wounded beings. To much of the galaxy, this was confusing. To the Galactic Empire, it was offensive. The Empire had ruled a third of known space for over 6,000 cycles. It did not call itself cruel. It called itself efficient. Stability was achieved through absolute deterrence. Rebellion was prevented by making examples. War was not a contest between armies but a corrective process applied to entire civilizations. The Empire did not distinguish between civilian and military infrastructure. Population centers produced soldiers. Cultural institutions produced dissent. Medical facilities preserved future resistance. In imperial doctrine, a hospital was not a sanctuary. It was a reservoir. When imperial observers first catalogued human behavior, the reports carried a consistent tone of disdain. Humans wasted resources on the unproductive. They risked personnel to retrieve the wounded. They established protected zones that slowed campaigns and complicated logistics. Some imperial strategists argued that humans would be useful auxiliaries, their humanitarian impulses exploited to stabilize conquered regions. Others argued that humanity itself was a liability. The debate ended when humans intervened in an imperial suppression campaign on the edge of the Narith Expanse. An imperial fleet had moved to pacify a subject world whose population had failed to meet extraction quotas. The resistance was disorganized and poorly armed. The outcome was never in doubt. During the orbital bombardment phase, human hospital ships entered the system, broadcasting neutral transponder codes recognized under galactic convention. They established triage zones, treated injured civilians, and, most provocatively, treated wounded Imperial soldiers whose own medships had been reassigned to fleet support. Human doctors returned Imperial troops to fighting condition and sent them back with supplies and medical data. The Imperial fleet commander filed a formal complaint. Humanity responded with an apology for any inconvenience and requested coordination protocols for future humanitarian operations. The Empire did not reply. Instead, it began to study human hospitals. Imperial analysts mapped their locations, supply chains, evacuation corridors, and energy profiles. They noted the absence of defensive armaments. They observed that human medical facilities continued to operate even under threat, often refusing evacuation orders if patients could not be safely moved. They recorded that human doctors remained at their posts during bombardments, trusting in the neutrality they believed the galaxy respected. The conclusion was simple. Hospitals mattered to humans, and in Imperial doctrine, whatever mattered to an enemy was a legitimate target. The first strikes came without warning, across 12 systems where human medical infrastructure had been established. Imperial task forces altered firing solutions mid-campaign. Orbital batteries realigned. Missile salvos adjusted trajectory. Planetary siege cannons shifted aim from government complexes to mark neutral zones. The Empire did not announce the change, IT did not need to. Human hospitals were clearly labelled. Their transponders broadcast continuously. Their structures were deliberately designed to be unmistakable from orbit. White hulls, red markings, universal medical symbols translated into dozens of alien visual languages. The first hospital died in silence. An orbital station above the agricultural world of Talaris absorbed 3 kinetic strikes in rapid succession. Its outer rings collapsed inward. Emergency bulkheads sealed too late. Life support failed compartment by compartment. The station's medical AI continued triage until its core was destroyed, calmly instructing staff to prioritize children and critical patients as decompression alarms filled the corridors. There were no survivors. On the surface below, planetary hospitals were next. Precision bombardments targeted underground emergency wards thought to be secure. Bunker-penetrating munitions collapsed reinforced caverns filled with refugees. Mobile surgical units were destroyed while in transit, their convoys identified and eliminated by orbital reconnaissance. Human communications lit up across the affected regions. Distress calls. Automated alerts. Medical personnel requesting ceasefires, pleading neutrality, transmitting codes and conventions the Empire had signed centuries earlier. The Empire responded with a single broadcast, translated into human languages with clinical accuracy. Medical infrastructure is not exempt from corrective action. The strikes continued. Humanity watched. They watched children die in surgical bays. They watched alien civilians perish beside human doctors who refused to abandon them. They watched hospitals that had treated Imperial soldiers reduced to debris. They did not retaliate, not at first. Human fleets moved, but not toward Imperial worlds. Evacuation corridors were established. Rescue ships flooded into burning systems. Human crews boarded collapsing stations under fire to extract survivors. Triage centers were rebuilt where possible. Even as bombardments continued, human medical staff treated the wounded pulled from the rubble, including Imperial soldiers injured by their own bombardments. The Empire took note. Imperial command interpreted the lack of immediate retaliation as confirmation of their assessment. Humanity was emotionally bound by its own principles. It would not escalate. It would not risk broader war. It would absorb the losses and retreat from contested regions. To ensure compliance, the Empire escalated. The second wave targeted memory. Imperial intelligence had identified humanity's reliance on medical data archives and artificial intelligences trained on centuries of accumulated experience. These systems did not merely treat patients. They preserved institutional knowledge, cultural commitment, and continuity of care. Destroying them would cripple humanity's ability to rebuild. Strike teams infiltrated hospital networks. Viruses corrupted diagnostic AIS mid-procedure. Surgical robotics froze or malfunctioned. Cryogenic storage facilities failed catastrophically, erasing thousands of lives preserved between stars. The Empire broadcast footage of the destruction, not as propaganda, but as instruction. Mercy prolongs conflict, the transmission stated. Compliance restores order. Across human space, something changed. The executions were not broadcast. That detail mattered later, when the coalition tried to argue that it had not intended provocation, only discipline. They would claim it was an internal security measure, a controlled response to non-compliance. They would insist there had been no spectacle, no cruelty meant for an audience. They were correct on a technical level. They were wrong in every way that mattered. The women were taken first because the coalition believed symbolism worked best when isolated. No grand announcement was made. Guards arrived earlier than usual. Names were read from a list that had been revised several times, as if accuracy itself might soften what followed. The women stood when called. They did not resist. They did not cry out. They asked procedural questions, requests for written charges, confirmation of status, the right to notify command. Each request was ignored with increasing discomfort by officers who had not been trained for this part of war. The coalition had fought dozens of species. It had crushed rebellions, sterilized worlds, and erased cultures with mathematical efficiency. But those acts were always framed as necessity or survival. This felt different. Perhaps it was the way the prisoners maintained dignity even as their status was stripped. Perhaps it was the silence. No screaming, no begging, no curses to justify cruelty. Perhaps it was the unsettling certainty in their eyes, as though they were witnesses rather than victims. Records would later show that the final moments were brief, and no speeches were given. No confessions demanded. The coalition officer overseeing the act read the authorization code twice, his voice unsteady enough that the translation software flagged emotional variance. The women were killed quickly. When it was over, the camp returned to routine with a forced efficiency that fooled no one. Guards avoided eye contact. Equipment was sterilized. Logs were altered to reflect termination due to security breach. Human command learned of it through absence. Names stopped appearing in medical status updates. Requests for verification went unanswered. Neutral observers reported irregularities but could not confirm details. For 6 hours, human channels remained active. For the next 6, they did not. That silence spread faster than panic ever could. Across human space, ships halted mid-translation. Couriers were recalled. Non-essential traffic was suspended. The galaxy mistook this for logistical failure, for exhaustion, for the quiet collapse of a species that had overextended itself. Human allies waited for pleas. Human enemies waited for rage. Neither came. Instead, a single transmission was sent through every diplomatic relay, every neutral archive, every system that had ever received a human treaty or request. IT was not longed. IT did not contain threats, demands, or ultimatums. IT was an acknowledgement of receipt. The message confirmed the names of the dead, their ranks, their service records, their POW identification numbers. It cited the exact clauses violated, cross-referenced with both human and coalition legal frameworks. It included timestamps accurate to the second. At the end was one sentence. The protections afforded under human restraint doctrine are hereby withdrawn. Coalition translators struggled with that phrase. The word withdrawn carried multiple connotations in human language: retreat, removal, revocation. Analysts debated which interpretation applied. None of them liked any of the options. What followed was not immediate retaliation. That unnerved the galaxy far more than an attack would have. Human fleets did not surge forward. No weapons were fired. No threats issued. Human diplomats did not storm councils or issue condemnations beyond the original transmission. They simply stopped explaining themselves. Coalition commanders ordered heightened alert status, expecting sudden strikes or desperate offensives. They received none. Human forces continued to lose ground in some regions, continued to defend stubbornly in others. But something had changed in the way they fought. Human ships no longer issued warnings before firing. They no longer disabled engines when a kill was tactically cleaner. Targeting solutions prioritized command hierarchies over battlefield advantage. Coalition losses began to rise, not catastrophically, but consistently. Interrogations of captured human soldiers became more difficult. The prisoners still followed the rules, but they no longer attempted to correct violations. They no longer reminded guards of protections or procedures. When mistreated, they recorded it silently. One coalition interrogator noted with unease that the humans had stopped arguing about legality. They behave, he reported, like the outcome is no longer for us to decide. Within coalition leadership, debates intensified. Some argued the execution had been a mistake. Others insisted it had been necessary. Most were simply confused by the lack of response. They had expected humans to break. Instead, humans had closed something. Internal human communications, declassified much later, revealed the truth. The executions had triggered a doctrinal shift so rare it had not been invoked since humanity's earliest interplanetary wars. Restraint was no longer mandatory. IT was now conditional. Human history carried long memories of what happened when cruelty was met with emotion rather than resolve. Those lessons had been written in blood centuries before humanity ever left its home system. They had learned, painfully, that rage burned out quickly, but preparation endured. So they prepared. Human shipyards activated projects long shelved under moral restriction. Weapon systems designed for absolute certainty rather than deterrence were removed from archival status. Targeting algorithms were recalibrated with fewer exclusions, not none, just fewer. Human leaders addressed their populations once more. There was no triumph in their voices, no call to vengeance. They spoke instead of responsibility, of boundaries, of consequences that existed whether or not one believed in them. They named the dead women. Every broadcast ended the same way. They stood by the rules. We will stand by them now. Coalition intelligence finally grasped that something had gone wrong when human diplomats formally withdrew from mediation frameworks they themselves had helped design. Not in anger, but with meticulous paperwork and advance notice. Observers noticed a chilling detail. The withdrawal notices included timelines. Humanity was giving the galaxy time to step aside. Some did, others did not. Coalition space began to experience failures that could not be explained as sabotage. Communications dropped at critical moments. Logistics hubs malfunctioned with improbable precision. Fleets arrived at rally points to find human forces already gone. Objectives achieved without resistance. Targets neutralized without engagement. IT was warfare conducted like accounting. Coalition officers started dying, not on battlefields, but in transit. Ships vanished between systems. Command centers lost power long enough for data to be erased before restoration. Entire strategic doctrines became obsolete overnight, and still, humanity issued no declaration of total war. That declaration came instead as a quiet addendum to the original transmission. IT clarified a misunderstanding. Humanity, it explained, did not seek annihilation. Nor did it seek conquest. What it sought was correction. The addendum ended with a line that would later be etched into memorials across multiple species worlds. You mistook our mercy for identity. Mercy was a choice. Humanity is what remains when that choice is taken away. Only then did the Coalition understand. They had not provoked monsters. They had revealed custodians who were no longer willing to hold the door. Prison camps across Coalition space were suddenly evacuated, not out of compassion, but fear. Guards abandoned posts. Officers attempted to destroy records, only to find them already copied. Human POWs were released into chaos, guided by encrypted signals they had never known they carried. Some were rescued, some were not. Human command accounted for every loss. They did not announce what would come next. They did not need to. The galaxy felt it in the way human ships moved now, not cautiously, not aggressively, but purposefully. As though the war had finally been reduced to a solvable problem, as though humanity had finished pretending this was about survival. IT was about judgment now, and judgment, when rendered by a species that had mastered restraint before power, did not arrive loudly. IT arrived accurately. Humanity did not pause to grieve. There was no time. The moment the news of the hospital's capture spread, councils across the colonies activated emergency protocols that had long lain dormant. Plans for defense, communication, and rapid deployment were dusted off and rewritten on the fly. Ships were refitted, AI cores repurposed from research to strategy, and civilians trained to assist in whatever ways they could. Every mind, every hand, every resource was enlisted. Humanity was waking from 2 millennia of peace into a war it had never wanted but could no longer avoid. The first challenge was organization. Communication across light years was slow, even with the most advanced subspace relays. Yet humans, with their characteristic patience and ingenuity, established relay nodes that bounced encrypted messages, coordinating actions faster than any outside observer might have believed possible. Fleets that had once existed merely as ceremonial patrols were now armed and strategized into divisions, each with a specific role, each capable of operating independently if cut off. Humans had no illusions. They could not match the galactic kingship for ship, but they could outthink him. Elite task forces were formed, each a blend of engineers, pilots, strategists, and scientists. They were faceless to the public, their names unimportant, but their skills legendary. Some specialized in infiltration, others in sabotage, and still others in intelligence gathering. Humanity relied on subtlety and precision, striking where the enemy was weakest rather than confronting overwhelming force head-on. Every plan, every calculation, every simulation tested the limits of human creativity. The first operation was reconnaissance. Tiny ships, cloaked and silent, slipped past the King's patrols, observing the hospital from orbit. Cameras and sensors transmitted streams of data, showing corridors choked with alien soldiers, energy shields humming with alien technology, and prisoners, scientists, medics, and civilians, hidden in makeshift holding areas. The Galactic King had underestimated humans' determination. Even under constant surveillance, the human teams found ways to transmit information back to headquarters without detection, exploiting blind spots in alien sensors. Meanwhile, humanity's fleets were not idle. Though smaller and less powerful, they were maneuverable and agile. Skirmishes erupted in the void. A handful of human ships, using decoys and feints, lured larger alien vessels into traps. Mines crafted from converted research probes detonated at precisely calculated intervals, disabling engines or weapon arrays. Humans adapted quickly, analyzing every loss, every success, refining tactics in real time. The Galactic King had not fought a foe like this before, one that learned, adapted, and struck with precision rather than brute force. In the shadows of these battles, human operatives carried out sabotage missions. Boarding parties infiltrated supply ships, cutting communications, stealing fuel, and planting devices that would cripple alien systems when the final assault began. Small victories accumulated, morale building with each success. Every scientist rescued, every supply line disrupted, was a reminder that humanity was not helpless, that the spark of defiance ignited in the hospital had spread across the stars.